orientation is to simply be present with whatever's here in this moment, which might be a busy mind, or it might be a sad heart, or it might be a painful body.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. On the Wisdom of the Body, we're all about body intelligence, which involves having a relationship with your inner world and also with your outer world. But your outer world comes through your inner world in order to get to your awareness. So the qualities of your inner world, memory, attachments, physiological conditions, and scars, for example, are going to impact the way you perceive the outer world. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we often don't seem to have the same version of reality as other people. Well, shoot, then who can we rely on? In the traditions of yoga, which I studied and taught for many years, the body and mind are purified before a person gets to the stages of meditation. If your body is an instrument that reads the world, wouldn't you rather it be a clear one? There are a lot of reasons we don't have a clear instrument, but each of us has a responsibility to keep working on that clarity. Otherwise, we're slipping into delusion. And the worst thing about a delusion is that you don't know you are in it. So we've got to be humble and get curious about our own patterns and behaviors. Otherwise, the distractions of the world can really fog up our proverbial glasses. But not everybody finds it easy to meditate. And Lord knows few of us have a quiet spot to meditate in these days. My guest today helps people get to know their minds better out in nature. And our talk really got me thinking about people's different perceptions of the climate. Is it changing or is it not? Do we perhaps fear the changing climate because of some imbalance going on in our own bodies? Or do we not see that the climate is changing for that same reason? I don't have the answers, but I'm going to keep working on being a clear instrument. My guest today guides people to nature, the greatest of all teachers. I'm so happy you're here tuning into this discussion. You're listening to the Wisdom of the Body. Today I'm here with Mark Coleman, who's a teacher at Spirit Rock and has taught insight meditation retreats since 1997 worldwide. Mark is passionate about integrating meditation and nature and leads wilderness retreats through his organization Awake in the Wild, as well as nature-based meditation teacher trainings. As the co-founder of the Mindfulness Training Institute, Mark also leads year-long mindfulness teacher trainings in the UK and US. He's an author, and he's written a book called Awake in the Wild, Mindfulness in Nature as a Path of Self-Discovery. He's also written 2 other books, Make Peace with Your Mind, and his most recent book, From Suffering to Peace. He lives in Sausalito, Marin County, California, which is actually where I live too. And he likes nothing more than hiking, biking, and kayaking in the outdoors. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we were commenting before the recording started today that we both just had our air quality improve here in Northern California. We're very happy about that. And, that's pertinent to our discussion because we're talking about mindfulness in nature and we're talking about meditation in nature, and there's so much changing right now outside. And one of the most beautiful things that I think has happened for people since the pandemic started is that people are getting outside and they're walking around in their local parks, and they're just maybe something about not being able to travel other places is allowing people to explore the outside spaces around them. Are you noticing that as well, Mark?
Yeah, it's been a really, as you say, one of the nice shifts with the pandemic is, seeing people walk around their neighborhoods, get to know their neighbors, but also get to discover there are parks and little trails and woodlands, and nice, living like you do in Sausalito, and we have the headlands and national park right on our doorstep. Same was true for me, that I got to really explore through walking, hiking, biking, all the trails around here, and discovered many beautiful places I hadn't been to, walks, trees, vistas. So yeah, no, it's been a treat. And I've also noticed one thing that's been interesting is I've noticed a lot more diversity in the people who are out in nature, which has been an interesting observation to see. Just the variety of people who are getting out seems to be much more diverse than in a typical year. And that makes me happy.
That makes me really happy too. And, one of the things that happened to me last month, I went to buy something at REI and I was standing in line, and there was a huge line to get into REI, more than any other store at the mall. And then I saw this sign saying that bikes were sold out, and tents and all the things that, you need to have fun outside. Well, you don't need those things to have fun outside, but obviously they are great. And I was really happy to see that. And also to see that REI was having the biggest line of all the stores. I took that as a good sign as well.
Yeah, no, I think there has been a huge rush. I mean, sometimes you have to wait 6 months now for a bike or a kayak. I think it's really woken people up to how powerful nature is as a resource. And it's something like with anything that we have on our doorstep, we take it for granted. And then when possibility of that's taken away, which it was around here when the parks are closed, or when we have the space to explore it, because so many of us are now not traveling to work, commuting to work, or flying around a lot for work, it's really opened up this accessibility. And again, just made me very happy to see that explosion in interest in nature, and people. It just speaks to the need for people to get outside from the four walls of whatever building, house, office they're in, and actually come into a more three-dimensional reality away from screens and devices, and how restorative that is to the nervous system. We're living in such stressful times with a whole litany of things we could go into. What's clear is that nature is such a balm, a soothe, a place of resource and nourishment and beauty that people are finally really taking advantage of and appreciating.
I'm so intrigued by the fact that you focus on bringing people out into nature for meditation. And, I remember when I was in Ayurveda school, they had this little meditation cave behind one of the dorms. And it was just like a little kind of mini mountain that somebody had made out of concrete, and you could climb underneath it and just sit inside of it like it was a hollowed out mini mountain to kind of cocoon you into a quiet space. And so, when a lot of us are seeking time to meditate, this idea of the sensory experience needing to shift in some way, whether it's reducing the external stimulation or changing the external stimulation, but also somehow going in nature has the potential to increase the stimulation in other ways. So I'm really curious about how you started this work particularly. I also would love to hear about, you're one of the most experienced and most well-known Buddhist teachers in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'd love to know a little bit about how you got on this path and to focus the way that you have been in your work.
Yeah, well, it's been at this point quite a long history. I started in England, so I was raised in England and was living in London in a squad. I was a punk and anarchist and a student and a bit of a rebel, and was involved in a lot of protests, but was very unhappy in myself and also in the world, and was looking somewhat unconsciously, but looking for ways to not be so anguished and angry and sad and frustrated with the world and myself. And I stumbled upon a Buddhist meditation center in the East End of London back in the 80s, which was kind of a rare thing back in those days. And mindfulness and meditation were not so ubiquitous as they are now, and really took to the practice of mindfulness and loving kindness, and really woke up a passion for me of studying the mind and really trying to understand what brings happiness, what really brings genuine peace and freedom. And so studied in England for some years, went to Asia, studied with some teachers for some years, and then eventually that brought me to the US to studying in the insight meditation tradition with Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg and others. Ended up landing in California and connecting to Spirit Rock, and went through a teacher training with Jack Kornfield, and then began teaching as a Buddhist meditation teacher. And very quickly after I'd been teaching some few years, a couple of things happened. One is when I came to the States, I fell in love with the wilderness and just the wild beauty that's here. That's just, there's so much vastness in the wilderness areas. And so so much of my early years here, I would spend a lot of time outside, backpacking, hiking, camping. And then I started to do my own meditation retreats for myself outside, meditate outside. And I quickly came to see that many of the fruits and the insights and the teachings that were being pointed to in the Buddhist tradition, various meditation teachers and traditions, were really very accessible and available in nature in a somewhat effortless, accessible way. And so as I learned so much from my own practice outdoors, I began to lead people in nature retreats, wilderness retreats, taking people out for 7 to 10 days, camping, hiking, backpacking, rafting, mostly in silence as a way to, quiet the mind and attune more deeply to the natural world. And they quickly became very popular. People saw, like I did, just how profound and also beautiful and joyful they are to go out into a natural landscape and bring that meditative awareness. And so that's been much of my journey the last 20 years, is guiding people through my Awaken the Wild organization, and now running teacher trainings for people who want to be guiding in a similar way. And I still teach at Spirit Rock and in various Buddhist places, but my love and my passion is really integrating mindfulness in nature. As the subtitle of my book said, mindfulness in nature is a path of self-discovery. So it's really about discovering our own nature, inner nature, but also discovering nature and coming into a deeper relationship with it.
I know that your background's in insight meditation. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Which I don't know that I've done exactly the way that you teach it, but is that what you do when you're with people outside in nature?
Yeah. So I would say that, as having been Buddhist teacher for 20 years and a practitioner for many more, that's sort of the frame that I hold internally. And the frame of the retreat is, in some ways not dissimilar to if you went on an insight meditation Vipassana retreat. They're in silence. There's a lot of mindfulness-based practice. But the difference is I'm really attuning not just to the inner world, the mind, body, and heart, but I'm really helping people attune to their senses. It's a very embodied practice, and also attuning to the elements and nature around them, and to coming into a deeper understanding and relationship with nature and the natural world, and seeing how much wisdom and insight can be had through a very alive relationship with whether it's the forest or the mountains or the ocean or meadows. We learn so much from the natural world, as all indigenous cultures know, from having that intimate relationship with nature. And so I'm using the mind training component of insight meditation practice of really, I see my role as a facilitator to help people work with their minds and their bodies and their hearts and all the various things that challenge people in meditation, to work with those in a way through mindfulness so that facilitates a deeper connection and attunement to the natural world.
And I'm sort of envisioning you like a transcendental poet taking people out into nature and everyone having these amazing, deeply connected experiences and then coming back and writing about it. Is that one of the things that emerges for a lot of people? Like what emerges that you see for a lot of people when they go through an experience like that?
Yeah, well, I think many things. People get very quiet and very still inside. People feel a lot of joy, a lot of delight, the beauty of wildflowers and seeing eagles flying and the beauty of trees and skies. And then also the deep love, the heart, can't help but be touched and opens into love and affection, reverence. At times people open the more kind of mystical, sacred dimensions of nature and the earth. And then as I guide towards the end of the retreat, there's also, especially in these times, with the fires burning and, just the general climate disruption that's happening. Also what arises is a tenderness and a sadness for what's happening in the earth and a desire to engage more actively to help protect and steward the earth. So there's a whole range of experience, but definitely people generally traverse through feeling, deeply nourished and heart opened, touching joy, feeling, and then also feeling a much deeper sense of connection and interconnection with life and each other, and then insights that come. Nature's full of teaching about life and death and everything in between. So it's a really rich panorama of experience.
And even just listening to you talk about those experiences, literally I'm sitting here tearing up because I was driving around this morning, because Mark and I both live in the same town and we've been inside for 5 days or something because our air quality was so bad. And today was the day where we finally got good air quality. And I actually looked at the Purple Air app this morning and said, oh my gosh, the air is so good in Fairfax. I'm going to drive out to Fairfax and get my kid outside this morning. And as we were driving in to this road, we were commenting on how beautiful it was. And because we were, essentially starved for nature for 5 days, it's sort of like after fasting when you eat a food, the relish that you have for it. And we were driving through and I definitely had that experience. But I also had this experience that was a but after my beautiful observation. And my mind would move and say, until it burns. I was like, oh my gosh. And, so is the sense of, and I know because you're a meditation teacher, you can observe that, okay, Heather, that's not the present moment. That is your mind moving somewhere else. Now, how do we know if when our mind is moving that whether or not we should listen to it?
Yeah. As the Yoga Sutras point to, the mind is almost always in movement, and, the stilling of those movements and formations is one of the challenging tasks of the yogi, of the meditator. So how do we know how to listen to that? I think it's sort of a both and. I think it's, your example, I think it's an important one. We both live in the present, and our mind is so often not in the present. It's in the future and in the past. And so here you are having this beautiful experience of being touched and relief of being outside and the beauty that comes from being and seeing nature. And we do also have this, layer of cognition that can also abstract ourselves and, take in a bigger swathe of time and see, most likely, much of the forests in California and the western states will burn probably next decade. And that, prior to the settlers coming here, that was a natural process. And it's been sort of usurped a little bit with fire suppression for 100 years. So it's both and. It's both feeling the beauty and the joy and the connection, the tears. And there's an awareness that, this too is impermanent and fragile and fleeting, just like everything else in this earth, which can either make us depressed or it can make us more alive in the moment and appreciate what we have and to work for, whether it's this election or work for conditions that will support the earth to thrive. So I think, both we live in those two worlds of the immediate experience and a broader understanding of life. And I think what's key is mostly we're lost in our mind. And so what normally happens is on the drive or on the walk you're on, we're lost in worrying and grieving and angsting about the loss of the fires that aren't actually happening in this moment where you're walking. And so it's really important to ask ourselves, to what end, is this thought helping me in this moment, or is it actually taking me away from the potential joy of just a simple walk in the woods? And so it's really knowing when it's skillful to pick up those thoughts and ideas and when to actually put them down, whether they're supporting of well-being or whether they just lead to an angst that you can't actually do much about.
Yeah. I don't know if I've actually studied insight meditation. I've studied a couple different kinds of meditations. Is that one of the insight meditation practices that you teach people?
Which practice specifically?
Yeah, I would say the sifting through of the thoughts, perhaps. I mean, because obviously when you sit and you start to bring your attention inward, and first of all, what typically happens to people, and you know way more about this being a meditation teacher, and also you're a psychotherapist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you've heard a lot of mental chatter come out of that people have shared.
Sure.
We all have that sort of observation about ourselves when we sit and hear that mental chatter happening. And how does insight meditation deal with mental chatter, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, well, there's different levels of thinking process and different kinds of thoughts. And so kind of relating to them differently, there's just the background chatter, rumination, what neuroscience calls the default mode network, where our mind just left to its own devices. We're sitting on a walk, we're, about to go to sleep, and our mind just sort of meanders, usually often towards what's wrong, negative, problematic. So that causes its own distress, but it's more just the chatter, just the radio static of the mind. And then, then there's other kinds of thought. There's more purposeful thought. There's planning. There's strategic thinking. There's analysis. There's envisioning. There's, so we really just have to both bring mindfulness and awareness to the thinking process and to start to discern what's worthy of my time and attention and what's actually just chatter that we can just drop and let go. And so in meditation, and I think in life, it's useful to know to keep sort of half an eye, as it were, on the mind and its thinking, and to be asking yourself, do I need to be thinking? Do I need to be ruminating? Is this helpful, or is this just sort of me spinning my wheels, or is it actually spinning in a way that's causing some angst or fear or anxiety? And is it worth picking up or putting down? So usually it's like if we live with the TV on all the time, rather than being very selective about when we watch the news or when we watch a series that we're interested in, it's the same thing, but we need to bring a certain level of discernment. So rather than the mind dictating when we think, there's a sense of choicefulness. So we pick up the thought and the need to think and strategize when we need to, and then we're very conscious about putting it down and allowing those times of space and quiet in the mind, which is very restorative. And actually, in terms of being outside, one of the things I'm teaching people is, we can go for a walk in the woods. And often when we take a walk, we're used to ruminating, thinking about a problem. And so encouraging people to notice that and then actually come into your immediate experience, just like we might hear the sound of a bird and very quickly we start thinking about, was that a nuthatcher? Was that a jay? Was that a thrush? And very quickly we're on to some ornithological analysis of birds and migrations. And it's like, wait a minute, I just heard a lovely sound of a bird. Let me just listen to the raw sound. So with nature practice, we're often coming back to the simplicity and the direct experience.
We're getting into the time of year for giving. Fall is Vata season, and it's a time of letting go and moving things around. Do you have a cause that you love to donate to? I actually think that giving is so important for our health. In fact, the word for heart in Sanskrit, hridaya, is made up of 3 characters, and together, these 3 characters signify an organ that receives, gives, and just keeps doing it over and over and over again. So if you have something to give, then give to something that pulls on your heartstrings, and you will see the magic that happens inside you. And I think that's why it always makes me think of poetry, because when I either read poetry or if I write poetry, and in fact, I do this weird sort of meditation where I've actually tried to teach this to people, but it's been a little where I actually will stare at a plant in my house or outside or wherever, and I'll just stare at it for a really long time. And I kind of go into like a little bit of a trance state. And then I write a poem. It's how I write all my poetry. At the end of it, there's a poem that came out of the plant. And for me, what it feels like, I don't feel like I'm thinking. It feels like it's sort of emerging in some other way.
Right.
And when I think about being out in nature and when we're around other humans, it feels like we really trigger each other in a lot of ways and trigger thoughts for some reason. And being out in nature where there are not thinking, speaking, acting creatures around us, I guess, except for the people who we're with, which luckily they're quiet when you're bringing them out. But, just having this experience of being somewhere still so that you know what that feels like, because most of the time we're really not around other people who have a sense of stillness. And I have this really vivid memory of when my baby was born and holding him. He doesn't have any thoughts. He's just this little urge-based, creature, being, and just being. And just the feeling of feeling and holding and being in the same space as someone who does not have thoughts, where you can't feel, because I literally can feel thoughts bouncing around people's heads when I sit next to them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sensitive that I literally can feel when they're thinking. I can't feel their thoughts, but I can see their eyes move. I can feel their bodies shift when their mind's going all over the place. But being around this baby, I didn't have that. And I would imagine it's probably kind of similar to what happens being out with plants, is that we're able to still our minds more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the plants still our minds, whether it's we're doing it or I think what happens in a nature retreat and just when we go outside with any kind of contemplative attention is that we're always connected, we're always influenced by our environment. And so, when we go out, into a redwood forest and we surround ourselves by trees that have been around for, a few hundred years, 1,000 years, who are just not lost in that conceptual mind that we are most of the time. And that rubs off, just like when we go to the beach and we were just watching the waves, not thinking about them, not studying them, just allowing them to kind of wash over us, as it were. That has an influence on the mind. And so in some ways, it's more often like nature is actually inviting, encouraging, and influencing the mind to quieten. And that's really one of the reasons why, for many people, meditating outside is easier, because one, there's more going on. If you sit quietly in a room, like in that cave that you talked about when you were studying, all you've got is you and your crazy mind. If you go outside, you've got, the breeze blowing against your face and the sounds of the rustling leaves and the fragrance of the grasses in the meadow and the sounds of life around you and the sun on your skin. And so it becomes much more easy to rest the attention in the present, that the bodies are always in the present, the senses are always attuned to the present. And so the more that we're embodied and attuned to our senses, the easier it is to reside here in the present. And it's really just the mind, the thinking mind, that leaves and goes into some imaginary world of thought. And so that's why nature's such a support, because it makes that process and the struggle a lot easier. A lot of people struggle with meditation. Oh, I can't follow my breath. It's too hard. I get too distracted. So, well, you just rest your attention with your senses and see, and it's just so much easier to abide more in the present moment without so much struggle.
I have a very vivid memory of the first time I meditated, and I went away to yoga teacher training. I didn't know that we were going to be meditating every morning for 30 minutes and that we weren't really given much direction either. We were just told to sit and given just sit, basically.
Right. Sit and shut up.
Yeah, sit for 30 minutes. And I remember, all the things that I went through in that moment, to try all the little tricks I started to play with myself while I was in that moment. But one of the things I also remember was the sense of anxiety that came up for some people, just sitting there doing nothing, even though we're literally just sitting. And that somehow that was bringing up a lot of anxiety for people. So how much of this practice do you think is about finding the mechanisms in your body that you use to calm yourself?
I mean, from a perspective of mindfulness, which is different than concentration, which is often a lot of practice, at least the root of meditation practice in the yoga tradition, which is about developing samadhi, which is a form of concentration and one-pointedness. Mindfulness practice, even though it draws on that need to gather and collect and focus and steady the attention, the difference with mindfulness, and this is something that even experienced meditators very easily overlook, is the point isn't to actually have or create any particular experience. The orientation is to simply be present with whatever's here in this moment, in this moment, in this moment, which might be a busy mind, or it might be a sad heart, or it might be a painful body, or it might be the sound of garbage trucks, as it was this morning for me in my meditation, or sound of kittens meowing. And so the practice, both in insight, and also in my Nietzsche teaching practice, is really, how do I be really present to what's here, whether I like it or not, want it or not, to not be carried away with the mind and its thoughts. So we can be aware of thoughts without being lost in them. We can be aware of our physical pain without caught up in reacting to our body and hating it. We can be feeling tremendous sadness and not be drowning in it. So mindfulness really is the capacity to be present with whatever's here. And in that sort of unconditional or uncompromising way of meeting experience, then we can really learn and be transformed by it.
And mindfulness has really made its way through a lot of different spheres in the last, we say, 10 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so.
And including like the healthcare space.
Yeah.
I saw you had a talk that you gave at Sutter Health about mindfulness. And is that something that you train healthcare providers on?
Yeah, I certainly have done. Yeah, I think in the healthcare field is, especially with even prior to COVID, was one of the most stressful places to work for various reasons: the suffering, the time pressure, the resources constraints, and all of that. So I really enjoy training particular audiences in mindfulness, and I've worked a lot in tech and other places, but I really particularly enjoy working with people on the front line, whether it's nurses, anybody in healthcare, teachers, first responders, people who have that high stress load just by the nature of the work that they do. And, giving people the tools and the techniques of mindfulness and the meditation practice can be tremendously resourcing and grounding and steadying. So it's definitely a pleasure of mine to teach those populations.
And I love that you shared earlier that you were a punk rocker growing up.
Mm-hmm.
I had sort of a similar background, actually. And I've always liked things that are very intense, I would say. I guess that when I think about being a punk rocker, I sort of think of an intensity that comes along with that. Maybe it's the spikiness of the hair or the spikiness of the jackets and the fashion, but somehow there's an intensity to that. And, when for me, it was more like pink hair and really loud guitar music and all that. And it's really interesting to see for people, what different sensory inputs, how they do really affect them. And when I think about how I feel, I guess, present, and sometimes I'm really surprised by the things that I feel really present doing. I don't know what the word would be if there's like that idea of peak performance. Is that kind of like a word in your lingo, or do you have a similar concept?
Yeah, I think sometimes I use the word optimizing. I sort of mix about this word because it gets co-opted by business and, the need to capitalize and monetize and optimize everything, mostly for profit. But I do think of mindfulness and awareness practices as ways that certainly enhance our capacities, awareness, our ability to respond rather than react, to know ourselves more clearly. So in that way, I think going back to the Buddha, it was the sort of the originator of mindfulness teachings. You could say that, he was really interested in how do you awaken the full potential of a human being? And so, meditation practice in its depth, and it's one of the reasons I wrote my last book, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness, was really pointing people to the root intention for mindfulness practice, which is not just to, have a nice cup of tea or to be present in and of itself, but really to understand what it means to be a fully alive, awake, responsive human being, and to support whatever allows that to grow and unfold and release that which is getting in the way. So I do think it is a support for becoming a more fully human being, which is no small task.
Yeah. And also another thing that you mentioned earlier was about nature and, how that maybe some people wanting to take on more of an activist role in regard to what's happening with the climate. And so how do you think mindfulness supports, obviously, because when I think of activism, I always tell everybody, like, I'm not a protester. I don't have that in me or whatever, because I always think that there's this level of aggression with it that somehow I don't have, or nothing's really like pissed me off enough to to go after that. But do you think that there's a way to do activism without aggression?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I don't think in any way being an activist means to be aggressive. I think it does mean that you're passionate. It means that you're engaged. It means that sometimes you're fierce. Sometimes you're powerful and, speaking truth to power and confronting injustice and perpetrators. And, so the difference, I think mindfulness and self-awareness can help is it's, to really track whether we're coming from a reactive place that's driven by, say, rage or hurt, or where we're not actually fully composed. When we're reactive, say when we're angry, usually we have blinkers on, we've got tunnel vision. It's harder to see the other person as a human being. We're seeing them through a particular lens. And so definitely, there's great examples of, whether it's, Dr. King and Gandhi and others who were amazing activists who, were coming from love. And that's really the difference is, I know many activists now who are very engaged. A friend of mine, Shelley Tigleski, who formed this organization called Pandemic of Love. It's really about helping meet the needs of people during the pandemic. And she's matched tens of thousands of people with people who have resources and people who have need. And so there's definitely ways to campaign. The current wave of protesting coming out of England, the Extinction Rebellion, they were very clear from the outset that they were going to protest disruptively and fiercely, but it was going to come from nonviolence and from love. And so it's very possible to do that and to actually make substantive impacts. It's not necessarily the norm.
And it's not necessarily easy either, because it's really easy for tensions to rise in moments like that.
For sure. No, it's very difficult. I mean, I think, the friends of mine who are very on the front line of Extinction Rebellion in England and London, and, they do a lot of trainings about how to de-escalate and how to deal with violence and how to stay grounded and supported when you're, on doing a frontline action. So, it requires a lot of mindfulness, actually, and self-awareness and self-discipline.
And the practices that you teach to people and probably also work with in your psychotherapy practice are really great tools for people to bring with them on those journeys.
Right. Yeah. And again, nature, for me is such a great teacher for how to do that, how to find groundedness, how to find rootedness, like from trees, how to find spaciousness like the sky, how to find connection, like sunlight. And so, yeah, there's always great teachings and metaphors wherever we look in nature. I think is a beautiful guide in that way.
Well, Mark, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I have a feeling that people are going to want to learn more about your work. So could you tell the listeners how they can find ways to engage with you? Sure.
Yeah, the main way now, I've sort of kind of integrated a bunch of different websites. So my main website is my name, Mark Coleman, MarkColeman.org. And there you can find meditations, talks, my schedule, links to, I lead a sunrise daily meditation, 7 a.m. Pacific time. I also I have an online nature meditation course coming up next week. And so different ways to contact me. I also have other organizations that I run. Awakenthewild.com is a portal for my graduates who are teaching nature meditation work. And then I also run these mindfulness teacher trainings. I've got one coming up in a couple of weeks, a year-long training, and that website's called mindfulnesstraininginstitute.com. But all the links, you can just go to my website, markcoleman.org, and you'll find it there.
I'm so grateful for our time together today. Just such a beautiful conversation. And I feel very honored to have this time with you. You're an amazing teacher, and I'm so thankful for the work you're doing in the world.
Well, lovely to be with you and lovely to share about this beautiful work. So thank you for the conversation.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.